The latest World Economic Outlook by IMF has underlined what many of us perhaps have instinctively known, that a world with unequal access to vaccines cannot possibly fully recover. In fact, the latest report has slashed India's GDP forecast by 3%, a deep cut indeed, showing the kind of pain we've suffered in the second wave. We are now projected to grow at 9.5% in FY 21-22.
Well, absolutely right. In fact, the IMF has also said that the vaccine access has emerged as the principal fault line along with which the global recovery splits into two blocks. To talk about that and a lot more, joining us now on ET Now is the Chief Economist at IMF, Gita Gopinath. Gita, appreciate you taking your time out and speaking with us today at ET Now. Let me first begin by asking you, the second wave impact, of course, is being seen in the GDP forecast that has been put out for India. How big a concern is a potential third wave?
Hi, Tamanna and Ruchi, great to join you. Again, when we were putting out our numbers in April, we had warned that if we were really at the beginning of the second wave in India, and if that was to rise dramatically and lead to very widespread lockdowns, then that would lead to a downgrade. And those were the risks that were actually realized, so which is why we had a 3 percentage point downgrade. Now, to your question of what comes next, we have a very modest recovery put into the numbers. And the reason is that unlike after the first wave, we think that this time around, the hit to confidence was greater. And also because of the uncertainty about the next, what will come next in terms of the pandemic, both of those will weigh on the recovery. So we have a fairly modest recovery at this point in our projections.
Ms. Gopinath, Tamanna here. Pleasure as always to speak, with you. I want to focus a little bit about the central theme of the report this time that you have underlined, which is how vaccine inequality is being seen in the way countries recover. So while your first world nations will recover faster, they've covered about 40% of their population completely. Developing markets, emerging markets will recover slower. In India, what do you see as the factors impeding recovery in that context? Do you think we are vaccinating too slowly?
The vaccine divide is a big part of the story behind the great divergence that we're seeing in different parts of the world. In the case of India, vaccinations started out slow. They picked up quite a bit and they came down again around May, but then they've gone back up. And so at the current pace of, I think, around 4 million shots in arm daily, India should get to somewhere close to 40% coverage by the end of this calendar year. Now, that would be very good. That's a good amount of coverage given the age distribution of India. But again, I think that a bigger push can be made on that front in terms of accelerating vaccine rollout, getting more shots in arm so that you get to higher numbers like around 60%. But that's really essential. Parts of the world where you've gotten to 50% and more coverage, you really are seeing, you do see cases going up. You see the Delta variant, you see the cases going up. But hospitalizations and deaths remain controlled, and that makes a big difference in terms of the economic recovery.
Geeta, while we're talking about India's vaccination plan, we have been able to vaccinate about 44 crore people so far, but we have seen a lot of flip-flops coming in as far as the vaccine procurement policy is concerned. Even now, the big concern seems to be that the 25% quota that was left by the centre for private sector is not being picked up. Given the fact that you've spoken at length about vaccine inequity in your report as well, do you think perhaps India in a way has gone wrong with their vaccine procurement policy?
So, vaccinating 1.38 billion people was always going to be a major challenge. I will say that since April, I think a good development was the central government deciding they were going to procure 75% of the needed vaccines. and make it available for free to states. So that was certainly a very welcome step. But again, there has to be a big vaccination campaign to get a lot more people eager to get vaccinated, get, like you said, get everybody to use whatever potential production capacity exists to put shots in arm. And that should be the number one priority on the health front. Now, if you look at the most recent Sero surveys, they do suggest that 2/3 of the population may have been infected. And that provides some protection, but we know that you need an additional vaccine dose at least to get to much higher levels of protection. And with the possibility of newer variants coming up, you really have to do this preemptively now and make sure that you get to very widespread vaccinations.
Ms. Gopinath, I want to jump back for a second to the 3% cut in growth forecast, largely because of the second wave. Now, the second wave undoubtedly had huge repercussions on lives. A lot of lives were lost. It was tragic the way it hit India, and the human losses were great. But on the other hand, the lockdowns weren't as extreme as with the first wave. Economic activity didn't really grind to a halt in that sense. And we're seeing that in some of the corporate results, which are being declared now as well. So what are the key reasons behind that growth cut? Is it because of consumer sentiment, which has also been hit?
You're right that compared to the first wave, there was no national lockdown. And if you look at the hit to activity, that was much harder in the first wave than it is in the second wave. So, but that said, just given how catastrophic the second wave was and how disruptive it was to people's lives, there is a minimum amount of hit that did come about, which explains the 3 percentage point drop. Another important piece of this is in terms of the recovery. So if you look at high frequency indicators now, you see in terms of industrial activity, you are seeing recoveries happening, but much weaker when you come to services sector. And so, we think that there will be a pretty subdued kind of a dampening effect on confidence for a while, and especially with the risk of another potential wave in India, that the recovery will be slow.
Geeta, having said that, I also want to understand from you on the recent price pressures that have, of course, become a concern as well. How do you foresee inflation expectations evolving going forward? Do you see it becoming more persistent, forcing the central banks globally to take preemptive action?
Oh, inflation is in the news everywhere, in all different parts of the world. And the specific response to your question depends upon which part of the world we're talking about. In the case of advanced economies, I would really focus on the US, given in terms of inflation readings, that's really where the big concerns are. I wouldn't worry about the Euro area and definitely not about Japan. So, but if you look at the US, what we are seeing is certainly extraordinarily high inflation readings, but a significant part of that is being driven by kind of pandemic affected sectors like, restaurants or used cars and so on. And so that should be transitory. We're certainly not seeing widespread wage inflation, though we're certainly seeing it in some sectors, but not at all, not kind of a very broad-based increase. And inflation expectations remain anchored. So in the case of the US, we expect that inflation will be around 4% this year and come down by the end of next year by 2.5%. And that's the time we think, toward the end of 2022, when we think that the US Fed would be likely to start raising rates, given our projections of inflation and employment that we have. Then that would call for an increase in rates towards the end of next year and latest by early 2023, which means that asset tapering would happen in the first half of next year. So that's what we have. Now, in case of emerging markets, of course, there are very different pictures. In India, again, inflation readings are very high. Core inflation seems quite sticky, which is a concern. There's a question of what does that imply for monetary policy? It's a bit of a tricky trade-off here because in India, there is still a lot of slack in the economy. You can see if you look at employment, where employment is now relative to where it should be, there is slack there. If you look at capacity utilization, there's slack there. So there is an argument to keep monetary policy accommodative, which is what we would say for now, what the RBI is doing, while at the same time providing forward guidance of how they will respond if it turns out that inflation expectations are really moving far away from their comfort zone.
In India's context, again, Ms. Gopinath, you have in your report and in your blog as well highlighted how different countries across the world are supporting their economies in different scales. And here, once again, your more developed nations are pumping in more money, while emerging markets seem to have run out of their first round of firepower, so to speak. In India's context, what do you think is the need of the hour? Do we need a lot more fiscal support coming in right now as we hope to emerge and recover from this second wave and are preparing for a possible third one?
I mean, in the case of India, like other countries, you have to be really flexible and agile in providing support. And you saw that in the second wave in India when the Indian government extended the provision of free food rations, the expenditure that was needed to procure vaccines, the additional spending that was needed for the health system. So, you will have to respond to the need of the hour. But in terms of a more systematic response, I would say that the Indian government can and, it should provide additional support in the form of income support to low-income households, support to medium and small and medium enterprises, also for health spending where they promised quite a bit that would need further support. And again, I would highlight education. I think that's one priority area which will need fiscal support, given that that's been so hard hit in this crisis.
Geeta, while you're talking about various things that the government can do, let me also get your focus on what's happening with this whole fuel price debate in India, with prices of fuel, petrol and diesel touching almost close to 100 rupees per litre in many states. The central government says that they will not cut the taxes because they're providing for free food and free vaccination as well. On the other hand, you have the common man feeling the pinch. So how should one really do the balancing act in a case like this?
I mean, it is absolutely a difficult trade-off. Now, it is an important source of revenue for the government. There's no doubt about it. And it is being used, that revenue is being used to help the poor people, to help with the rural road building, which are all important initiatives. So I think the strategy has to be one where, while you are raising revenue through these taxes, that you're also building up the social safety net. You're making sure that you're providing transfers to those who are, at the bottom of the income scale, so that they are not getting hard hit by it. But it is for now an important source of revenue for the Indian government to do these kinds of schemes.
Ms. Gopinath, I want to switch tracks a bit and talk about a proposal that the IMF staff put together recently on a $50 billion plan to vaccinate the world. It envisaged vaccinating at least 40% of the global population by the end of this year, and you put it out a few months ago. Has there been a positive reception to this plan? Do you see the world moving forward? Because you have a situation right now where developed nations, which already have a relatively large part of their population vaccinated, are looking at booster shots. They're looking at now vaccinating, children, even before some parts of the world have even 3 or 4, 5% of their population vaccinated.
We are actually seeing progress being made on the proposal. When we put it out at that time, we had said we needed about 35 billion in the form of grants, additional 15 billion in the form of concessional financing. Now, that concessional financing and more is already available. Of the 35 billion in grants needed, around 10 billion has been made available. So there's a gap of about 25 billion. The other big ask, we said, was to have 1 billion vaccine doses donated this year from surplus countries. And so far, the G7 have announced vaccine donations, and based on their announcements, there should be around 500 million doses. So we're only about halfway there, but at least we're halfway there in terms of 500 million doses being donated this year. But that said, of course, we want to see the deliveries happen and as soon as possible. So there is more that can be done on that front. So we're seeing progress. I think the big gaps remain on diagnostics in terms of testing, in terms of therapeutics, and preparing countries to put shots in arm. They need support to be able to do that. But we set up a task force or a war room, as we sometimes call it, with the WHO, the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank came together and put this up, and precisely to kind of identify where the gaps are and to make sure there is immediate action to close these gaps. So I feel hopeful that we will be able to meet the targets.
Geeta, having said that, I also want to ask your views on cryptocurrencies. IMF has recently put out a blog where they've warned against adopting cryptocurrencies like bitcoins as legal tender. In India, we're also close to working on a bill for cryptocurrencies. We still don't know which way the government is going to head, but so far, by the looks of it, it seems that the government and the central bank are working towards a central bank digital currency. We don't know what is going to be the fate for other cryptocurrencies such as bitcoins. What is your advice going to be for the central government?
So I know, as the piece that we put out said, when it comes to cryptocurrencies, which are very different from central bank digital currencies, which is the other thing you mentioned. But if you talk of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, they don't really serve the role of money. I mean, they are highly unstable in their value, not a good, efficient source for transactions, not a unit of account, not where we're pricing goods in terms of. So, it doesn't have that value. It's an interesting speculative asset class where a lot of money has gone in, but that's the space it fills at this point. So I think it's very important for individual countries to make the decision that, what kind of risks are they willing to accept in terms of allowing cryptocurrencies to be widely used in however they decide that to be. Because if you don't have the right kinds of regulations, the right kinds of laws to be able to control how it gets used, then that can create macro instability in your economy. And that's what we flag. So again, you have to, there are some people who want to play with this kind of technology and speculate in it, and it's for them to do it. But there are implications for the economy, and countries should decide how well their systems are set up to protect their macroeconomy from it. Now, when it comes to central bank digital currencies, which are a completely different technology, a completely different instrument, there, of course, we're seeing several central banks around the world exploring it, considering it, because to provide some sort of a public sector option when we're talking about digital coins, as opposed to just having private sector digital coins. So that's something to explore, but there are financial issues involved with it, there are legal issues involved with it, and so it's not a trivial task to just put this out, but it's certainly worth exploring.
Just to follow up on the crypto question, Ms. Gopinath, because it is, I think, something that has taken a large part of the world by imagination right now as a fiat and a way of actually trading. Do you think that the gray zone of policy making that exists in some countries, including India, is a dangerous one? Because people are not sure whether this is legal, illegal, could it become illegal tomorrow, or what direction we're really heading in. Do you think it's important to have clarity at the earliest?
I know, yes, absolutely. It helps to have clarity, but I think a fair assumption for people who are in this space is that they are working with a very risky, volatile asset class. It's highly speculative in terms of investment, and so it's a very risky investment. So, the regulation around the world is still evolving. There are international organizations that are figuring out what the rules of the game should be, because this is not just a national issue, it's an international issue. And that will not happen overnight. It will take time. So, there are these risks involved for anybody who's dabbling in it.
Geeta, I also want to ask you on your global growth forecast. In fact, you've maintained it at 6%, mostly led by recovery coming in from the United States as well as easy monetary policy as well. We're, of course, speaking on the day when the US Federal Reserve FOMC meeting is, the outcome is going to come out, and investors are closely watching out for any cues from the US Federal Reserve in terms of, monetary tightening. Are the markets fearing it a little too much? Are the central banks going to take very, very slow steps as far as any kind of a tightening is concerned, given the fact that we are coming out of a very, very difficult situation?
When we talk about U.S. monetary policy, I think first and foremost what they will focus on is what's happening with inflation and employment in the U.S. I mean, that's what the U.S. Federal Reserve said. And their assessment is that it will take some time before it gets to the point where they need to start tapering or to raise interest rates. Again, we're seeing more governors deciding that they're going to move sooner than, waiting until the end of 2023 and beyond. So that could move up. But again, I think what's important is, there is a global recovery happening. We are seeing parts of the world, including the US. Now we have 7% growth projected for the US, which has global spillovers. It's good for the world also. So, there is a good argument that at some point when you've gotten to full employment and you've got your inflation at where you want it to be, that you start tapering and that you start raising rates. So I think it's mostly a communication challenge over here, which is to make sure that, this is a tricky time. There's still a lot of uncertainty about how much slack there is in the economy, what's going to happen with inflation, how much of it is going to be transitory. So this is a very tricky time to make all these assessments. So the challenge is going to be to provide sufficient clear guidance, clear triggers of when they will move, so that when the reversals happen, when you start tapering, when you start raising interest rates, it's a smooth process. And it's not as if that's not happened in the past. I mean, there have been many periods when they've tapered and things go on just fine. But then you have the example of 2013 when you can get a major hit to the global economy. So I think that's where the challenge is going to be.
Just as we wrap up this interview, Ms. Gopinath, I want your broad comment once again on vaccine inequality and how crucial is it going to be. One of the methods or solutions which is being proposed is a waiving of all patents to make a larger number of vaccines available around the world more quickly. Do you think that's the way to go?
So I will emphasize very strongly the need to address vaccine inequity that persists even 7 months after we had vaccines being injected into people's arms. And that's, the good news is that the vaccines work when it comes to protecting you against severe disease and hospitalizations. So we have a weapon that can end this pandemic. We just have to get it rolled out everywhere. And, I think it's important to push on all fronts, multiple fronts, trying to get more production in different parts of the world. But again, in the near term, I would say, again, the next 6 months, given what we have in terms of supply, and it's hard to bring supply online much faster, for the next 6 months, I think donations, surplus vaccine donations are critical. And if we can do that, we really can get to a much better place in terms of at least getting all high-risk population in the world vaccinated.
All right, we'll have to wait and see if countries do really open up their coffers and distribute these vaccines, even as many are beginning to look at the possibility of booster shots just 7-8 months after vaccines were first rolled out. Thank you so much, Ms. Gita Gopinath, for speaking with us here at ET Now. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.